You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Introducing Meta Ray-Ban Display, the world's most advanced AI glasses. With a full-color display built into the lens of the glasses, it's there when you need it and gone when you don't. Send and receive messages, translate or caption live conversations, collaborate with Meta AI, and more. Be one of the first to try Meta Ray-Ban Display. Visit meta.com/Meta Ray-Ban Display to book a demo and find your pair.
Oh, the sick day struggle is real. But with Dimetapp, it doesn't have to be. Children's Dimetapp works quickly to soothe multiple bothersome cough, cold, and allergy symptoms in a single dose. Our fast-acting formulas are designed with kids in mind, so they get everything they need and nothing they don't. Available in liquid and on-the-go chewable tablets. Tap the banner now to shop at Amazon and say goodbye to the sick day struggle with Dimetapp. Use as directed.
Hello everyone and welcome to another History of the Second World War summary episode. As the podcast leaves the Battle of Britain behind and shifts focus to the events of 1940 in North Africa, I thought it would be a good time to cover once again the Rise of Mussolini episodes that were released for the podcast back in 2020. These 4 episodes, the second series of the podcast, covered the rise of Italian fascism during the early 1920s, the creation of the fascist government led by Mussolini, and then the path of interwar Italian society. The events in Italy and the contributions that Italy would make to the Second World War after joining the conflict in June 1940 can easily be forgotten. Almost more important to the war would be the role that Italy would play during the 1930s. Mussolini would manage to thread the needle by both being very militarily active in both Africa and Spain, while also being seen as a source of reason and stability by the governments in Britain and France. This would remain true even after Mussolini entered into closer relations with Germany after Hitler's rise to power, resulting in the so-called Pact of Steel. The path to that alliance with Germany started at the negotiating tables, really at the Paris Peace Conference in 1919. Italy had been an ally of the Entente during the First World War, trading their support for the war against Germany for promises of territorial expansion in the Mediterranean, when Germany and Austria were going to be defeated, of course. That defeat occurred in 1918, and then the territorial expansion did not. The British, French, and newly arrived Americans agreed that the Italian territorial demands were not something that could be honored while also making the other changes they wanted to make in Eastern Europe. This meant that territory that Italy so greatly desired went to the newly created nations in the Balkans and to the new state of Turkey. This created a sense of betrayal, and it would be an important driving force in post-First World War Italy. Just as important to the rise of Italian fascism was the rise in the power of Italian communism during the early 1920s. The interwar years are full of governments around Europe being very concerned about the possibility of communism spreading into their territories. Italy would be no different, with the early Italian fascist groups primarily being made up of what were known as squads. The men that were part of these squads, the squadristi, were often military veterans that had been discharged after the war and were left a bit listless within Italian society. The fascist movement was a movement of young men, many of which had been conscripted into the Italian army before they had married or established any kind of career. Then after 4 years of military service, they were dumped back onto the Italian economy that had been wrecked by the war. They were welcomed into the nascent fascist movement under Mussolini and other leaders, and they would be supported by the Italian industrialists. As with many communist movements, the strongest support for communism was among factory workers. In Italy, the industrial heartland was in the north, and it was not a coincidence that this would also be the area where the fascists would grow their support the most. Very rapidly from 1920 to about 1922, the fascists would gain that support, first in the industrial, and then in the political, and finally among military leaders in Italy, because they were seen as a bulwark against communism. The fascists were one of the few groups, the squads, the fascist squads, were one of the few groups of people that could match the communists in their passions and in their actions. The Italian communists were marching, they were violent, and it was unclear to many how they could be dealt with unless they were met by similar levels of passion and marching and violence. This is one of the ways that the rise of Italian fascism was echoed by the rise of German Nazism. They both gained support from the elites in their own societies due to their passionate anti-communist views and actions, which would match the fears of those elites about the rising tide of communism. At the center of all of these actions was Benito Mussolini. Mussolini had, like so many others, served in the Italian army during the First World War. He had at one point been a member of the Socialist Party, and the early Italian fascists would be described as a left-wing socialist party like many others at the time, although they would later shift their focus. Much like the choice of the name National Socialist for the Nazi Party, Mussolini's previous association with the socialist has fed into the myths that the Italian fascists were in some way a leftist political group. Mussolini himself made a point to say that while he had been a socialist, he no longer was by the time that he came to power, saying, quote, "In terms of economics, we are overtly anti-socialist. I do not regret having been a socialist, but I have cut my bridges with that past. I have no nostalgia. I don't think about entering socialism, but rather about leaving it. In economic matters, we are liberals, because we believe that the national economy cannot be entrusted to collective entities or to the bureaucracy." End quote. During 1920, the links with the previous socialist ideologies were specifically severed by Mussolini and the other important fascist leaders. Mussolini would firmly establish himself as the leader of Italian fascism during a meeting in Rome in November 1921. At the meeting, the fascist leaders decided that from that point forward, greater central control would be exercised over all the Italian fascist groups, which had previously enjoyed greater independence. They also decided that Mussolini would be the new singular leader of Italian fascism, setting him firmly on his course to becoming the leader of Italy over the years that followed. However, he would not become the leader of Italy without one more event, the pivotal event that would see Mussolini transition from the leader of Italian fascism to the leader of the Italian government, and that was the March on Rome. During 1921 and 1922, the fascists had continued to grow in strength, and over that time they had used marches as a way of displaying that strength and to intimidate their opponents. Marches were a basic idea that were based on the simplest possible action that a group could take. The fascists would collect a group of people, and then they would just walk somewhere. It was the type of action that threatened violence against anybody who tried to stop them, but put the onus for starting that violence on the other party. So the fascists would sort of have plausible deniability that they could not be blamed. They were just marching. Somebody else started the violence. In the areas where these marches were often conducted, the only group that might try and stop them were the communists. As the fascists had the support of local governments and law enforcement, usually nobody in those sort of groups would try and prevent them from doing whatever they wanted to do. The March on Rome was simply the largest of this type of action up to that point. It would begin at the Fascist Congress, which would occur on the 24th of October 1922. The plan was to launch a march not directly into Rome, but instead for fascist groups to meet at Perugia, which was about 160 kilometers north of Rome. From the moment that the march had started towards Rome, there were two important facts about the march that must be considered. First of all, it was not well organized, and the 5,000 individuals who arrived at Perugia were poorly equipped for the journey ahead, and they were also very short on food. The second important fact was the true state of the marchers was not known to the officials in Rome. They believed the marchers, could be a serious threat to public order. Mussolini and the other leaders of the Italian fascist movement had spent the preceding months and years building up their political contacts among the Italian political parties. They'd been able to exert their influence before the march began, and then as the March on Rome was occurring, the one person who could have definitely ended the march simply decided not to. That person was King Victor Emmanuel III, who could have, with a single order, declared martial law and then sent in the Italian military to break up the march. The soldiers that were required for this action were in position. Their leader was known to be loyal to the government and to the king. He would have followed that order. This could have happened. They could have realized that it was 5,000 ill-equipped, ill-prepared marchers instead of some mighty horde of northern fascists. But the king did not give the order, due to fears that it would cause even greater violence and perhaps even an Italian civil war. In fact, instead of breaking up the march, the king contacted Mussolini to bring him into a new government with the position of prime minister. And so, while the march was something of a shambles, it was completely and totally successful. Suddenly, Mussolini was at the head of the Italian government, the first fascist-led government in Europe. And all because 5,000 individuals who barely knew what they were doing had decided to march on Rome. And those 5,000 individuals had been built up in the imaginations of Italian leaders to be something far greater than they actually were. And then suddenly, Mussolini's the prime minister, and Italian fascism was off and running. Hey guys, millions of men have problems with ED every year. Maybe that's you. Maybe you don't want to talk about it because nobody wants to talk about it, but it happens, and RexMD is here to help. RexMD is a licensed provider of ED medication, and it starts with just a short, simple quiz to help determine the best path forward for you. Everybody is different. There are no one-size-fits-all treatments, but RexMD has all of the options. Oh, and after some private consultations, your personal treatment arrives directly to your door in discreet packaging. You are not alone. RexMD has been chosen by 475,000 men. So if you need to be ready when the mood strikes, head on over to rexmd.com/SWW to get up to 95% off your ED treatment. See full details and usage at rexmd.com. Prescription required. Results may vary. Visit rexmd.com/SWW and get up to 95% off your ED treatment. Thank you, RexMD, for sponsoring this episode.
This podcast is brought to you by Carvana. Carvana lets you buy your next car on your terms. Explore a massive inventory online, filter for what matters, and find your perfect match. Then choose delivery to your home or pick it up at one of Carvana's iconic car vending machines. Every car also comes with a 7-day money-back guarantee, so you can make sure it's the right fit. Buy your car on Carvana. Delivery or pickup fees may apply. Limitations and exclusions may apply. See our 7-day return policy at Carvana.com.
Carvana.
The shocking path that Mussolini used to reach the position of prime minister resulted not in revolution, but more just business as usual for the Italian government, at least in the early years. Mussolini was only in power because he was at the head of a coalition government of Italian conservative parties, and he would prove to be willing to work with them to stick largely to their policies. This was the reason that those same conservative political leaders had supported Mussolini, under the belief that once he was in the government, they would be able to control him. As it would happen, Mussolini was more just biding his time. The core uniting feature for all of these groups was their disdain for any of the socialist groups within Italy, and that would keep them cooperating and working together for far longer than you might imagine. Mussolini's close cooperation with the other leaders caused him one problem that was perhaps a bit unexpected: his old fascist supporters. They had been pursuing a true revolution of Italian society based around the idea of unity and strong nationalist values. Now they had achieved their goals of a fascist-led government, and they considered the result to be far too normal. Even those that did not think that Mussolini had betrayed them, at the very least believed that his cautious approach would cause Italian fascism to lose its momentum. Or, as Robert Griffin would say in The Nature of Fascism, quote, "The regime in practice did nothing to undermine the privileges and prestige enjoyed by the monarchy, the nobility, the traditional landowning aristocracy, the army, industrialists, or the church. Nor did it even attempt to bridge the acute divides between popular and high culture, or wipe out the snobbery associated with class distinctions, education, and wealth." End quote. All of these things were things that the fascists wanted to change within Italian society. But things would begin to change when, in April 1924, a new set of elections were held, the first under Mussolini's government. The elections that were held were not as skewed as other such elections in, say, for example, Germany after 1933, but there was one very important change that was made for Italian law for this election. It was called the Acerbo Law, which stated that the list or coalition of parties, they were called lists in Italy, that gained the most of the votes in the election was immediately given 2/3 of the seats in the Chamber of Deputies. The right-wing party coalition that was already leading the government was almost assured to get the majority of the votes, basically destroying the future for all the other opposition parties without outright outlawing them, because the results of the election were basically a foregone conclusion, and the coalition led by the fascists received 66.3% of the votes, 2/3 of the votes in total, if only because a lot of the other parties didn't even really show up. Even the favorable election did not cause an immediate shift to a revolutionary government or revolutionary policies by Mussolini, and instead the general path of a cautious approach remained until he was finally pushed to make a decision in late 1924. In June of that year, Giacomo Matteotti, a prominent critic of the regime, would be kidnapped and killed by a fascist squad. The following 6 months would then see an increase in the amount of fascist violence throughout Italy, which left Mussolini in a position where he either had to side with the fascists and take control of that violence by leading it, or go the other direction and suppress it. In early January 1935, he made his decision, and he took responsibility for Matteotti's murder and all the violence that followed. And this gave essentially government sanction for all that had happened, and proved that Mussolini was in an unassailable position. Over the following months, Mussolini would move to reassert control over the Italian fascists by either removing other leaders or promoting them into the government, with the goal of separating the leaders from their followers, which allowed for the status quo to continue. Early 1925 would also be the period where the fascist changes to Italian society really started to take hold, with, for example, the newspapers coming under greater governmental control, and there would be a rollback in women's rights, which the fascists blamed for the falling Italian birth rate. They would also begin moving towards making the long-term changes to Italian society that the fascists desired, with educational programs altered to glorify the fascist party and the fascist ideals. One of the interesting side effects of these changes, which would impact the Italian war effort, was that many of the students that had been hearing this propaganda all of their young lives would begin to enter into society as adults in the late 1930s, and they found that none of the promises and ideas that they sort of had been told were happening, were actually present. The promises that had been made about the benefits of a fascist society remained unfulfilled, which caused an erosion of support for the regime just at a time when that support was needed the most, especially among young Italians. Along with the remaking of Italian society to try and purge it of what was seen, I guess, as socialists and un-Italian ideas, one of the core policies of Italian fascism was violence and the glorification of that violence. In the early days of the fascist movement, this violence generally took the form of small-scale political violence in the streets of Italy. Then, when Mussolini became prime minister, it shifted into large-scale internal violence against those that did not support the fascist government. But then after Mussolini had full control of Italian society, he reverted back to an earlier promise for how violence would be used: Italian expansion. Since the very beginning of modern Italy, the Italian unification of 1871, there were certain territories that were outside of the borders of Italy that were seen as part of Italy. Recapturing some of those territories had been the primary reason that Italy had joined the First World War. After the Paris Peace Conference, many of those territorial ambitions remained unresolved, and Mussolini was already thinking beyond them. His eyes turned to Africa and the territory that could be gained through the expansion of Italy's colonial holdings. The goals were both just straight-up square kilometers of control, but there were also important economic issues that Italy had that Mussolini hoped to resolve with more territory being brought under the control of the Italian government in Rome. High on the list was access to more natural resources. Of course, Italy wanted more of those. But there was also the idea that Italians needed space to grow. And in fact, one of the major reasons for their expansion into North Africa was in the hopes of large numbers of Italians moving to those territories in search of a better life and more lucrative jobs. Sort of an economic colonialism is one of the programs that the Italians wanted to put in place, especially in Ethiopia after they took control. It would not be very successful in the years that they controlled those territories. Mussolini's expansionist goals would lead to violence in 1935 with the start of the Italo-Ethiopian War. Ethiopia was one of Africa's few fully independent nations during the mid-1930s, and the Italians sought to take advantage of this fact with an invasion to extend the pre-existing Italian territories in North Africa. And while the war would be far more difficult than the Italians expected, they would eventually take control of Ethiopia, at least for a few years. The Second World War would see war begin in Ethiopia once again, with the British and their allies working to once again push Italy out of the territories. While the war in Ethiopia did allow for a brief expansion of Italian-controlled territory, it would also greatly increase the tension between Italy and other nations, particularly Britain. Due to the threats posed to the British imperial interests in Africa, the two nations actually came very close to war, with the Royal Navy briefly being put on a war footing to answer any Italian threat. Such a conflict certainly would have altered the course of history, but it did not happen. But it was the first time that the relations between Italy and Britain had been truly tested after the First World War. The tensions between the two nations were just one example of the many of the rising tensions around Europe during the mid-1930s, and those tensions would come even closer to boiling over due to events in Spain. The Spanish Civil War is a major topic that will require its own summary episode, which will actually be the next summary episode released here on the feed next week, but the Italian involvement is worth discussing here. When Franco and his Spanish nationalist supporters began their attacks against the Spanish Republican government, Mussolini and the Italian leaders saw an opportunity to expand their control of the Mediterranean by installing a friendly government in Spain. To this end, they would provide military support that included military equipment, as well as the dispatch of several units of Italian infantry to fight with the nationalists. Franco would eventually be victorious during the Civil War, defeating the Republican forces that had been supported by the Soviet Union. However, that victory did not immediately show any real benefit for the Italians. Spain was absolutely wrecked by the long and devastating war, which prevented Franco from being involved in any of the events that would follow. Spanish neutrality in the future World War meant that any possibility of using Spain to close off the Western Mediterranean would not materialize, and this also meant that Spain was a terrible investment of British military power. There was a point in the mid-1930s, before other nations began rearmament efforts, during which the Italian military was seen as one of the strongest in the world, especially the Italian Air Force. However, the years of fighting in Africa and then in Spain would exact a toll on Italian equipment and supplies that it could not rectify before it entered the war in June 1940. More importantly, once other nations began rearming, it became apparent very quickly that the Italian economy could not come close to keeping up with the demands of modern war, which would be a theme for the Italian military throughout its entire participation in the Second World War. Overall, the interwar years would see Italy transition into the world's first fascist state. It would reorient its foreign policy away from France and Britain and towards Germany. It would build up its military to support its expansionist goals, and then it would enter the war in the hopes of great territorial gains and a boost to Italian prestige. And then, none of that would happen. Instead, Italy would find itself in another world war, in which its military was shown to be ill-prepared for the war that it would be called upon to fight, Italian industry poorly equipped to meet the demands placed upon it, and in an alliance where it was clearly viewed as a second-class military power. The only real difference is that the Second World War would somehow be even more disastrous for the Italians than the First.